A perfect wedding is dramatically interrupted when the groom's father shows up at the church to reveal a devastating secret from the past. What he reveals changes everything, leading to a confrontation that ends in a surprising way, with a call to the police. Get ready for a story full of twists, where the truth can be more shocking than any lie. The air in Atlanta, Georgia, seemed to carry a special vibe that summer. Aaliyah and Malcolm's wedding was just a few days away, and Aaliyah's family home was buzzing with excitement. The living room, decorated with fresh flowers and fabric samples, was filled with the sound of laughter from Aaliyah, her mother Lorraine, and her aunts. They were going over the final details of the ceremony, such as the table arrangements, the flavor of the cake, and even the floral arrangements that would adorn the altar. "I can hardly believe it's happening. My girl is getting married," Lorraine exclaimed, holding a satin ribbon in the same color as the bridesmaids' dresses. Aaliyah smiled widely, her eyes shining with happiness. She wore a casual and comfortable dress, yet still exuded the grace of a bride about to fulfill a dream. Meanwhile, the scene on the other side of town was very different. Malcolm was sitting in a stylish cafe with his two best friends, Jordan and Chris. Despite the relaxed atmosphere and soft music in the background, Malcolm's restlessness was evident. He drummed his fingers on the table, constantly fiddled with the collar of his shirt, and drank his coffee without really tasting it. Jordan, always the most straightforward of the group, finally broke the silence. "Dude, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Nervous about the big day?" he asked with a teasing smile. Chris laughed and added, "You're already tied down, bro. This is just the next formal step." Malcolm forced a laugh. "It's not that. I mean, it's a big day. I'm just thinking about everything that could go wrong. You know, details." He made a vague gesture with his hand, but the two friends didn't seem convinced. The conversation continued for a while, flowing between jokes about wedding vows and debates about which of the two would be next to marry. However, the tone suddenly changed when Jordan, without much ceremony, asked, "So, explain something to me. Why isn't your dad on the guest list? I mean, weddings are about family and all that, right?" Malcolm's smile disappeared instantly. He stiffened, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup as if the answer to a deep dilemma lay there. Chris noticed the discomfort and discreetly nudged Jordan, but the damage was already done. "My dad and we don't have a relationship that justifies him being there," Malcolm finally replied, his voice low but firm. Jordan, although good at sensing boundaries, didn't back down. "But isn't this a good chance to make things right? I've heard stories of weddings being the perfect moment for reconciliations. Aaliyah is so family-oriented. It seems like it would be important to her." "Enough!" Malcolm interrupted, his voice louder than he intended. People at nearby tables cast curious glances, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "My dad isn't coming to the wedding, and that's all you need to know. Let's change the subject." Chris, always the peacemaker, quickly steered the conversation to a discussion about suits, but the mood between them grew tense. Jordan gave Malcolm a long look, clearly intrigued, but decided not to press further. As the friends continued talking, Malcolm lost himself in thought. His father, Darnell, was a topic he rarely allowed to surface. The man's name carried weight, memories, and wounds that Malcolm believed were buried, but perhaps not as deeply as he would have liked. Even with all the happiness the wedding was supposed to bring, the shadow of Darnell seemed to loom over him, insisting on not being ignored. Meanwhile, at Aaliyah's house, the excitement continued. The bride, anxious and happy, barely noticed the emotional storm that Malcolm was trying to contain. But like all unspoken truths, it was only a matter of time before that would explode, putting everything at risk. The wedding day had finally arrived, and Atlanta seemed to share in the celebration with its clear, sunny sky. The beautiful church chosen for the ceremony was decorated with vibrant flowers that exuded a delicate fragrance, blending shades of white, pink, and gold that contrasted with the colorful stained glass windows. The guests, all impeccably dressed, filled the church pews while murmuring animated conversations about the couple and how perfect their union seemed. Outside, a black limousine pulled up. The door opened, revealing Aaliyah, stunning in a white dress with delicate lace details and a long train that looked like it was made of clouds. Her smile lit up everything around her. Lorraine helped adjust the veil while saying, You look so beautiful, my girl. I can't believe this day has finally come. Neither can I, Mom, Aaliyah replied, holding a bouquet of peonies while taking a deep breath to contain her emotions. At the altar, Malcolm waited, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt for the 5th time. His perfectly tailored black suit seemed to tighten more and more. He tried to smile at the guests, but his gaze betrayed something deeper, a mix of anxiety and worry. Jordan and Chris, standing beside him as groomsmen, tried to distract him with jokes. "Felix, man, you've already won. Just look at her," Chris said, discreetly pointing to Aaliyah, who was beginning to ascend the church steps. "Yeah, she looks amazing," Malcolm replied, trying to mask his unease. But the smile didn't last, especially since his mind was elsewhere, or rather, on someone else. He glanced at the church door, as if he were waiting or fearing that something would happen. The music began, and all the guests stood as Aaliyah entered. She walked radiantly, led by her father, who looked as proud as he was emotional. Malcolm watched the scene with a lump in his throat, torn between the love he felt for Aaliyah and the whirlwind of thoughts invading his mind. Finally, she reached the altar, and the ceremony began. The pastor, a man with a gentle voice and a warm smile, started the ceremony with words about love and commitment, drawing smiles and tears from those present. Aaliyah and Malcolm looked at each other tenderly, and for a moment, it seemed that nothing could interrupt that perfect moment. Then came the question that echoed through the church. "If anyone here has anything against this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." A heavy silence hung in the air. Lorraine held her breath. Malcolm looked down at the floor, hoping the moment would pass quickly. But then, a firm, deep voice broke the silence. "I have something to say." All eyes turned to the church door, where a tall, imposing man with gray hair and a confident posture walked slowly inside. He wore an elegant suit but no tie, giving off an air of calculated dishevelment. It was Darnell. Malcolm turned pale, his eyes wide as he struggled to maintain his composure. His breath quickened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Beside him, Aaliyah cast a confused and worried glance, immediately realizing that this man was more than just an unexpected guest. "Who is that?" Lorraine whispered from the front row, as whispers spread through the church like fire on dry straw. Darnell walked down the aisle, ignoring the curious looks and disapproving expressions. He stopped, staring at the altar, more specifically at Malcolm. His presence was like thunder on a clear day, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. "Sorry for the interruption," Darnell said, his deep voice echoing off the church walls. "But I couldn't let this wedding continue without saying something important." The pastor hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He looked at Malcolm, who still seemed frozen. Finally, the groom stepped forward, his voice low, but filled with contained anger. "Darnell, what are you doing here?" "I'm just doing what's right, son," Darnell replied, with a calmness that only made the situation more tense. "I need to say something before you make a decision that could change your life forever." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to regain control over himself. He knew Darnell was not a man to act without reason, but he also knew he couldn't trust him. "This isn't about you. This is my wedding," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "That's why I'm here," Darnell replied, stepping forward, his gaze fixed on his son. "Because this is bigger than you realize." The guests looked at one another, confused and intrigued. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Aaliyah held Malcolm's hand, as if wanting to offer support, but he was rigid, still staring at the man who had just cast a shadow over the most important day of his life. "If you have something to say," Malcolm finally spoke, his voice firmer now, "then say it already." Darnell looked around, pausing for a moment, as if he wanted to ensure everyone was listening. Then he took a deep breath, preparing to unleash a revelation that would change everything. "Malcolm, you are being sought by the police." Darnell's deep voice echoed through the church, and the murmurs ceased instantly. All eyes turned to the man standing at the altar, his posture rigid and his expression severe. Malcolm, who until then had maintained a controlled appearance, froze. He seemed to struggle to process the words that had just been spoken. "What?" Malcolm's voice came out low, almost inaudible, as Aaliyah beside him widened her eyes, her hands slowly slipping away from his. Darnell stepped forward, now facing the guests. "There is an ongoing investigation," he continued, his tone laden with an inescapable weight. "Malcolm's ex-wife, Monique, was found dead 2 weeks ago, and he is the prime suspect." A collective gasp swept through the church, followed by a wave of murmurs and incredulous whispers. Lorraine held tightly to Aaliyah's arm, as if wanting to protect her from any further impact. "This is absurd," Malcolm finally shouted, breaking the growing silence. He stepped forward, his face red with anger, and pointed at his father. "You've lost your mind, Darnell. Coming here to my wedding with a lie like this? This must be the height of desperation." Darnell stared at him firmly, not backing down in the face of the outburst. "I wish it were a lie, son," he replied. "But the police came to me. They are investigating your involvement with Monique. They have records of arguments, of fights. And now, with her disappearance and the body found, you are the only name that has come up." The murmurs grew louder, mixed with expressions of shock and fixed gazes on Malcolm. Aaliyah looked petrified, her hand covering her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. "You're not going to believe him, are you, Aaliyah?" Malcolm turned to his bride, his voice desperate. "He's always done this to me. Always tried to sabotage anything good in my life." He pointed again at Darnell. "You never supported me, you never wanted me to be happy. And now you show up here with this farce? This is low, even for you." "Don't try to turn this against me, Malcolm," Darnell replied, his voice calm but with a cutting authority. "You can scream as much as you want, but the facts are against you. Monique filed a restraining order against you. Remember that? And then she withdrew it. Now, with her dead, all of this has come back to light." "I didn't do anything to her," Malcolm roared, his voice echoing through the church. "We broke up and moved on with our lives. This is a setup, Darnell. And you know it." Darnell looked at him steadily, his eyes heavy with a mix of sadness and determination. "Then prove you're innocent." "But I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't let this continue without people knowing." The entire church was silent, a suffocating silence filled with tension. The guests exchanged nervous glances, while Lorraine held Aaliyah, who was now quietly sobbing. "You're a liar," Malcolm yelled, pointing at his father in anger. "That's all you know how to do. You don't want me to be happy. You never did." Darnell said nothing more. He just stood there, staring at his son, as the weight of the revelation hung in the air like a dark cloud. And then, as if the moment itself had been frozen in time, everything seemed to crumble. The ceremony that was supposed to be a celebration was now plunged into chaos and distrust. Aaliyah took a step back, distancing herself from Malcolm, as tears streamed down her face. "Malcolm," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" The groom looked at her, his expression a mix of desperation and denial. "Aaliyah, you can't believe him. I never hurt Monique. He's trying to ruin us." But it was too late. The shadow cast by Darnell had changed everything. Aaliyah remained at the altar, but her expression had completely changed. The happiness that had lit up her face at the beginning of the ceremony was now replaced by a mix of confusion, shock, and something she didn't want to admit: doubt. She still held the bouquet, but her fingers trembled slightly. Her mind was racing, reliving moments that had once seemed insignificant but now carried an unsettling weight. She looked at Malcolm, who was gesturing and protesting against his father, and couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Darnell's words echoed in her head. "You are being sought by the police." Each syllable seemed to open a new door to uncomfortable memories. Malcolm had always been reserved when it came to his past, especially about Monique. Aaliyah remembered how he would quickly change the subject when she asked simple questions, like where Monique was now or why they had broken up. He always gave vague answers, saying that Monique was troublesome or that it wasn't worth remembering the past. At the time, Aaliyah interpreted this as a way to move on, but now those evasions seemed like something more. There were also the times when Malcolm became defensive for no reason. Like that time, during the wedding preparations, when she casually mentioned that Monique must have been an important part of his life. He got upset, raising his voice, saying he didn't want to relive unnecessary things. Aaliyah felt hurt, but let the subject die to avoid ruining the mood. She also couldn't ignore the nights when Malcolm seemed lost in thought, his jaw tense and his eyes fixed on something distant. When she asked what was wrong, He simply replied that it was work or that he was tired. But now, looking at him, with the tension evident in every line of his face, Aaliyah wondered if those moments hid something darker. "Are you going to believe him?" Malcolm asked, his voice hoarse, breaking the silence between them. He seemed to plead, but there was still a hint of indignation in his tone. Aaliyah stared at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why would the police be investigating you, Malcolm? Why would Darnell have an official document?" She gestured towards the paper Darnell was holding. Her voice was low, but the intensity was clear. "Because he's trying to destroy my life, Aaliyah," Malcolm exclaimed, his voice rising an octave, almost desperate. "He never wanted to see me do well. That's all he does, sabotage me. Don't you see? This is his plan." Darnell didn't say anything immediately, but his silent presence seemed to carry more weight than Malcolm's words. Aaliyah shifted her gaze from her fiancé to his father, searching for a truth she couldn't find. "Malcolm," she began, her words coming out hesitantly, "I trusted you. I love you. But now I don't know what to think. You never talked about Monique. You always avoided the subject. I thought it was something you didn't want to remember because it hurt you. But what if it's something worse?" Malcolm shook his head, his eyes wide with frustration. "Aaliyah, don't do this. Don't let him poison your mind. You know who I am. You know I would never do anything to hurt anyone, let alone Monique." But his words didn't erase the doubts that were growing inside her. Aaliyah remembered how he had reacted defensively in so many situations, how he avoided details of his life before her. All of that, combined with Darnell's imposing presence and the document he had presented, made her mind spin. She took a deep breath, staring intently at Malcolm. "If this is a lie, why are you so nervous? Why are you so defensive?" "Because it's my wedding," Malcolm shouted, his nerves frayed. "You know how much this means to me, to us, and he's trying to ruin everything. I'm trying to protect us, Aaliyah." Darnell, who had remained silent until that moment, finally intervened. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. "I know this is hard to hear, Aaliyah, but you deserve to know the truth before making any decisions. It's not about destroying Malcolm. It's about preventing another tragedy." Aaliyah felt the words hit her like a blow. She looked at Malcolm again, searching his face for any sign of sincerity, anything that would dissipate that overwhelming weight. But all she saw was a tense man, on the defensive, with a glint of anger in his eyes that she had never noticed before. Reality began to weigh down on her. The memories, Malcolm's reactions, Darnell's presence, and the document. All of it formed a mosaic that Aaliyah didn't want to piece together but couldn't ignore. She remained at the altar, but the feeling that the solid ground beneath her feet was crumbling was inescapable. The church door closed behind Aaliyah and Lorraine, but the sound of whispers and murmurs remained. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Malcolm stood at the altar, breathing heavily, as if the atmosphere around him was suffocating him. He looked around, trying to regain control of the situation, but the suspicious gazes of the guests surrounded him like a silent tribunal. Outside, Aaliyah stopped next to a wooden bench in the church garden. The sun shone in the sky, but she could barely feel the warmth. With trembling hands, she took out her phone and dialed with hesitant fingers. Lorraine, beside her, held her arm, offering support without saying a word. "Atlanta Police Department," said a voice on the other end of the line. Aaliyah swallowed hard before responding. Her voice was low and shaky, but firm. I'm at the address of Grace Church on Peachtree Street. Malcolm Foster is here. He is wanted by the police. He is a suspect in the Monique Foster case." On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause before the operator responded, her tone professional and firm. "Understood. We are sending a unit to the location. Please stay safe." Aaliyah hung up, tears silently streaming down her face. "Did I do the right thing, Mom?" she asked, her voice choked. Lorraine, always protective, hugged her daughter, gently stroking her hair. "You did what you had to do, my love. This isn't about love or betrayal. It's about safety. Monique can no longer tell her story, but you can help find the truth." Inside the church, Malcolm sensed that something was wrong. He looked at Darnell, who stood still with a search warrant in hand. "Are you satisfied now?" Malcolm shouted, his voice heavy with anger. "You did it. You turned everyone against me." Aaliyah, He stopped, looking at the door. Where did she go? Darnell remained calm, but there was evident weariness in his eyes. She did what she had to do. She saw the truth, Malcolm, and chose not to ignore it. Malcolm looked around frantically, and then something inside him broke. He knew what Aaliyah had done. He turned toward the aisle, trying to reach the door. "I'm not waiting for this," he yelled, trying to push his way through the guests. But before he could reach the exit, he felt a pair of strong hands gripping his shoulders. It was David, Aaliyah's cousin, a big, strong man with an expression of pure contempt. "You're not going anywhere, Malcolm," David said, his voice low but filled with rage. "You're not going to escape what you did. Let me go." Malcolm struggled, trying to break free, but David held him tight. Two other guests, also relatives of Aaliyah, joined in to restrain him. "This is absurd. You're all going to regret this," Malcolm shouted, but his voice no longer held the same conviction. Darnell walked slowly toward where Malcolm was, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. When he got close enough, he looked into his son's eyes, and there was a deep pain in his gaze. "I never wanted to humiliate you like this, Malcolm," Darnell said, his voice heavy with sadness. "Do you think I wanted to do this at your wedding? Do you think I wanted to destroy the image Aaliyah had of you? But I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't sleep knowing what you might have done, knowing the danger you represent." "You don't know anything," Malcolm replied, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "You're playing with lies and conjectures. You have no proof." "It's not up to me to prove anything," Darnell replied, his voice serious. "It's up to justice. And you need to face the consequences of your actions, whatever they may be. The truth will come out, Malcolm, whether you like it or not." The church was filled with the muffled sounds of some guests sobbing, while others just watched, unable to believe the scene unfolding. The tension was almost palpable, like a rope stretched to the breaking point. Suddenly, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Red and blue lights began to flash through the church windows, announcing the arrival of the police. Malcolm struggled again, but David and the other men held him firm. When the officers entered, the crowd stepped back, making way. One of the officers approached, holding a pair of handcuffs. "Malcolm Foster?" he asked, his voice professional and controlled. Malcolm did not respond. He simply lowered his head, his body relaxing in defeat. The handcuffs were placed on his wrists, and he was led out of the church. Outside, Aaliyah and Lorraine watched as Malcolm was placed in the police car. He turned his face for a moment, searching for Aaliyah. Their eyes met, and for an instant there was something there, perhaps regret, perhaps despair. The silence in the church was so absolute that one could hear the faint creaking of the wooden pews as some guests shifted restlessly. No one spoke. No one dared to make any movement that could break the oppressive atmosphere of tension. Then, the sound of sirens approaching filled the air, growing louder until the red and blue lights began to flash through the stained glass windows of the church. The double doors at the entrance swung open, revealing two uniformed police officers with serious expressions. They walked down the central aisle with firm steps, and each step seemed to echo like a hammer striking, marking the inevitable moment that was about to happen. Malcolm, who had been standing next to the altar, lifted his chin but said nothing. His expression was a mix of coldness and defiance, as if he were determined to maintain his dignity even in this moment of defeat. "Malcolm Foster?" one of the officers called, holding a pair of handcuffs. His voice, firm and procedural, echoed through the sacred space. Malcolm did not respond immediately. He cast a glance at Aaliyah, who was sitting in the pew closest to the door, collapsed in Lorraine's arms. Their eyes met, but there was no longer any pleading or explanation in her gaze, only a mix of resentment and something that could be interpreted as regret. Aaliyah looked away, unable to face the situation any longer. Darnell, on the other hand, stood a few meters away from his son, arms crossed in front of his body and a serious expression on his face. There was no triumph in his demeanor, only a silent pain that seemed to weigh heavily on him. Malcolm finally looked at his father, and his gaze was like a blade, sharp and full of bitterness. "This is how it ends, isn't it?" Malcolm murmured, his voice low but filled with venom. "You got what you wanted, Darnell. Congratulations. I hope you're satisfied." Darnell did not respond immediately. He simply took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the situation. When he finally spoke, His voice was calm, but firm. "I didn't want this, Malcolm. I never did. But I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't stay silent knowing what I know." The officers moved closer, one of them gently holding Malcolm's arm. "Sir, please turn around," the officer requested. Without resistance, Malcolm complied. He turned slowly, and the metallic sound of the handcuffs closing around his wrists broke the silence, sending a collective shiver through those present. A muffled sigh escaped from Lorraine, who tightened her embrace around Aaliyah, as if she could protect her from all the horror unfolding before their eyes. As the officers began to lead Malcolm toward the exit, he paused for a moment and looked back at Darnell. "You abandoned me when I was a child," he said, his voice low and heavy with hurt. "And now you destroy me as an adult. Excellent job as a father, Darnell." Darnell briefly closed his eyes, as if the words were an open wound. But when he opened them again, there was conviction in his expression. "Maybe I failed as a father, Malcolm. But if this prevents someone else from being hurt, then I did what was necessary." Without another word, Malcolm was escorted by the officers to the door. The guests watched the scene as if they were spectators of an inevitable tragedy, their faces marked by shock, sadness, and disbelief. No one moved or said anything. It was as if the weight of the moment had stolen everyone's ability to react. Outside, the sirens still blared as Malcolm was placed in the police car. He cast one last look at the church, his eyes briefly stopping on Aaliyah, who was still in her mother's arms. She did not look at him. Her eyes were closed, and tears streamed down her pale face. When the door of the police car closed with a muffled sound, Darnell stood still, watching as the car drove away. He crossed his arms, his face serious, but his posture seemed burdened by the weight of that decision. He knew he had done what he believed was right, but the cost was high. Inside the church, Aaliyah finally broke the silence with a loud sob, sinking even deeper into Lorraine's arms. "I never really knew him, did I?" she murmured, her voice heavy with pain. Lorraine simply shook her head, unable to find the right words. Darnell slowly turned, facing the empty altar. The tension in the air was still palpable, but amidst the absolute silence, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The church was almost empty. The guests had left one by one, carrying with them the tension and weight of what they had just witnessed. Only a few family members remained at the site, murmuring among themselves or comforting one another. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange and gold. The cool breeze gently swayed the decorative flowers, but the air still felt heavy, imbued with the gravity of the events. Aaliyah was sitting on a bench in the garden, her veil removed and the bouquet forgotten at her side. She stared at the ground, her eyes red from crying, while her mind replayed the chaos of the day. Everything she had dreamed of, all the promises she believed in, had been shattered in a matter of minutes. But despite all the pain, there was something she knew she needed to do. She stood up, adjusting her dress with trembling hands, and walked towards Darnell, who was standing near the church gates. He looked tired, his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of his decisions had finally begun to manifest. He was looking at the horizon, but was lost in his own thoughts. "Darnell," Aaliyah called, her voice hesitant. He turned slowly, and for a moment, his gaze revealed surprise at seeing her there. But he quickly regained his composure, straightening up as he waited for her to approach. Aaliyah stopped a few steps away from him, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself from the cold or perhaps from the vulnerability she felt. I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice low and trembling, "for telling the truth, for doing what was right, even though it destroyed everything." Darnell sighed deeply, taking his hands out of his pockets and crossing his arms over his chest. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't do it to destroy anything, Aaliyah," he replied, his voice deep but filled with sincerity. "I did it because I knew it had to be done. I knew that if I didn't speak up, something worse could happen." Aaliyah bit her lip, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to return. "I loved him, Darnell. I thought I knew him, that he was everything I ever wanted. But now I don't know what was real and what was a lie." Darnell nodded, and his eyes took on a melancholic glimmer. "I understand, Aaliyah. Malcolm is my son, and part of me desperately wanted to believe that he wouldn't be capable of something like this. But another part Another part knew that I couldn't close my eyes to the signs. He paused, looking at the ground before meeting her gaze again. Monique was a good person. She had her flaws, like all of us, but she didn't deserve the fate she had. I couldn't let that go. I couldn't let another person, you, become a victim of something similar. Darnell's words hit Aaliyah hard, and she brought a hand to her face, taking a deep breath as she tried to process everything. You knew this would ruin everything, she finally said, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and pain. You knew everyone would see me as the woman whose wedding was destroyed at the altar. Even so, you did it. Why? Darnell took another deep breath, and his voice softened. Because the truth matters, Aaliyah. Even when it hurts, even when it breaks things we desperately want to keep intact. If I had stayed silent, the weight of what Malcolm could have done, or could do, would have been something I could never live with. He paused, his gaze becoming distant for a moment. I failed Malcolm in many ways. I wasn't there when he needed me most, and maybe that contributed to the man he became. But today, I couldn't fail you. I couldn't fail Monique. She deserves justice, and you deserve the truth. Aaliyah sniffled, wiping away a tear that escaped, but a small sad smile appeared on her lips. You were brave, Darnell. Brave enough to do what no one else would. And for that, I am grateful. No matter how much it hurt, you saved my life today. For a moment, they stood in silence, just looking at each other, sharing an understanding that transcended words. Then, Aaliyah took a step forward and opened her arms, wrapping Darnell in a tight embrace. He hesitated for a moment, surprised, but soon returned the gesture, placing his hands protectively on her back. Thank you, Aaliyah murmured, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Thank you for doing what was right. Darnell closed his eyes, holding her a little tighter before responding. I just wish things were different, that he were different. But at least today we did what needed to be done. When they separated, Aaliyah looked at him with a new appreciation, something she never imagined feeling for the man who until recently was just her fiancé's distant father. Now, he was something more, a man who had the courage to face the storm to protect those in need. A few weeks had passed since the day that changed everything, and Aaliyah was starting to piece her life back together. The shadow of that interrupted marriage still lingered in her memory, but it no longer consumed her. She had decided that, although what happened had left deep scars, she would not allow it to define her. Mornings now began with a hot cup of coffee on her porch, where she often opened a notebook and jotted down her thoughts. It was something she had never done before, but in a way, it helped her organize her feelings. Each word she wrote seemed to lift a weight off her shoulders, as if each filled page was a step toward freedom. Her routine also included regular conversations with Darnell, something she never imagined would happen. After the chaos of the marriage, he had become a constant and surprisingly comforting presence in her life. At first, she hesitated to answer his initial calls, thinking it would be strange to keep in touch. But Darnell showed a patience that touched her deeply, respecting her time and offering support without asking for anything in return. That afternoon, the two were sitting in a discreet cafe in the city center. The place had rustic wooden tables and large windows that let natural light flood the space. Aaliyah held a cup of tea with both hands, while Darnell sipped black coffee. They talked about everything: the progress of the investigations, the books Aaliyah was reading, the walks Darnell took every morning to clear his mind. You're handling this better than I expected, Darnell said, breaking the silence. He looked at Aaliyah with a mix of admiration and sadness. I know it hasn't been easy. Aaliyah smiled faintly, looking at the foam on top of her tea. It's not easy, she admitted. But I realize that holding on to what happened will only hurt me more. I need to move on. It's not like I have another choice. Darnell nodded, taking a sip of coffee before responding. You have a strength that many people wouldn't have, Aaliyah. I know you didn't ask for this, but the way you've dealt with everything, Monique would have been proud of you. And so am I. The mention of Monique made Aaliyah swallow hard, but surprisingly, she didn't feel the usual weight of sadness. Instead, she felt something close to gratitude for having escaped a similar fate. She looked at Darnell, her eyes shining with sincerity. Thank you, and thank you for everything you've done. I know this hasn't been easy for you either. Darnell sighed, placing his cup on the table. It hasn't, he admitted. Seeing my son being taken away by the police, it's the kind of thing no father wants to experience. But I knew it had to be done. Malcolm. He chose a path, and now he has to deal with the consequences. My only regret is that I didn't do more for Monique while she was still here. Aaliyah reached out, lightly touching Darnell's hand on the table. You did something now, Darnell. You saved my life, and who knows, maybe others too. That means so much more than you realize. They exchanged a silent smile, and for a moment, the shared pain seemed less intense. Aaliyah knew that this unlikely relationship with Darnell was a source of strength for her, a connection built amid chaos, but now an anchor in her journey of recovery. After coffee, Aaliyah decided to walk around the city. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, while the breeze carried the scent of flowers from the gardens and local bakeries. Each step felt lighter, as if the road ahead was finally free from the rubble of the past. As she walked, Aaliyah thought about what the future held. Malcolm was still awaiting trial, and she knew the media would continue to exploit the case for some time. But that no longer scared her. She had discovered that the truth, no matter how painful, was her greatest ally. The truth had set her free, even though the process of accepting that freedom had been one of the hardest things in her life. She passed a shop window and paused for a moment to watch a group of children laughing and playing inside a toy store. The sound of their laughter was pure, full of hope. Aaliyah smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: optimism. She didn't know exactly what would come next, but she knew she was ready to start over. As she continued walking, Darnell's words echoed in her mind. You have a strength that many people wouldn't have. Aaliyah wasn't sure where that strength came from, but she was willing to use it to rebuild her life. She was no longer the woman who felt lost and deceived at the altar. She was someone stronger, wiser, and above all, someone who had chosen herself. As she turned the corner, the sky was already tinged with deep blue, with the first stars appearing. The city was alive, and for the first time in a long time, Aaliyah felt that she was alive too. She smiled, took a deep breath, and kept walking. The road ahead was uncertain, but full of possibilities, and for Aaliyah, that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.